we go over the houses and what they mean, right? So that I can give you a better understanding of this, so that we can get it all out of the way immediately, all of that stuff. Um, because uh, here we go, whatever, right? Here we go. So, um, okay, so this is a night chart. What is the difference between a night chart and a day chart? A night chart is when, as you can see, these are whole houses, okay? A night chart is when, obviously, you were born at night, right? If you have a day chart, you were born in the daytime. So, as you can see here, now what determines a night chart in a person's uh, own specific birth chart is, you see this line here where it says ACDC. AC represents ascendant line, DC represents descendant line. So this all this stuff is ascendant line, just basically represents the horizon. Okay, that's to simplify it. What it represents here is, in the simplistic terms, is the horizon of the land, right, that you're on. So not necessarily the whole planet per se, right? But it represents the land mass that you're on, right? The time zone, right? So what happens here is that the day chart, right? In the day chart, your sun sign, right, which is represented by the circle with the dot in the middle, will be somewhere in one of these houses. Somewhere in one of these houses, okay? It could be in any one of these houses, okay? And it may even have numerous planets in those houses, okay? And that's okay, right? It still means that you have a day chart. If you have a night chart, what it means is that in any one of these houses, it means that your sun, which is right here, remember, the circle with the dot in the middle, is in one of these houses. So you could be born, so for instance, you could be born in Aries and still have your sun, right? Your sun in the 10th house, and still be, you know what I'm saying, and still be a Capricorn that just so happens to be born in the daytime. These things aren't necessarily exclusive to the zodiac sign, okay? It's just that I just happen to have a night chart. So what is that? So what exactly does that stuff mean? So what that means is, in essence, is that my sun, which is right here, okay, right here, let me pull it up, right here, okay, is below the horizon. So I was born at 7:30 at night, Trinidad and Tobago, waning gibbous moon, okay. That's the August 27th, 1991, as you can see here. So since the sun was down and the moon was not necessarily above the horizon at that time, but as you can see here, not necessarily above the horizon, but it was nighttime. You know what I'm saying? At that point in time, 7:30, the moon wasn't necessarily above the horizon, but it was the early stages of night, but it's still night nonetheless, right? So as you can see, the sun is right here. So what that means is that I have a night chart, okay? Now, if you have a day chart or a night chart, the night chart is significantly different from a day chart, and vice versa. If you happen to have a day chart where the sun, right, symbol is anywhere in any one of these houses, like I said, you can have multiple planets with the sun in any one of these houses, doesn't matter. It still means that you have a day chart, okay? But if you have a day chart, it is significantly, excuse me, different than when you have a night chart like I do, or just a night chart in general. People who have a day chart find it easier for them to become famous, okay? But the people who have a night chart, if and when they do become famous, they are often more likely to be even more famous than the people who have a day chart. Another significant thing is the most benevolent planet, or I should really, in the spirit of good faith, right, in the spirit of telling the truth, the most significant planets, okay, in a person's, or the most beneficial planets in the day chart, okay, is Jupiter and Mercury. And for the night chart people, the most significant planets for the night chart is Venus and Mercury. And Mercury is both day and night because Mercury is the most significant planet in the entire chart. Without Mercury, nothing moves. Without Mercury, nothing exists. Mercury is the most important planet in the entire birth chart. So, with that being said, let's go over it. So I'm not necessarily going to go over my specific birth chart or anything like that. I'm just going to tell y'all the significance of the houses and what they mean. Okay. So the first house represents I am. So it represents existence, right? It represents individuality. It represents separation of the spirit, right? Singularity, right? It represents like how it is that we all exist in a singular form, right? Most of us don't necessarily were born when we weren't born as twins, right? And because of that, this is a situation that we have in Aries, but the Aries represents also the innocence as children, right? This is why it is that they're saying that you have to be as innocent as a child. What it means is that Aries represents that level of innocence. It represents you having to learn to be, or you being open-minded from childhood all the way to adulthood, okay? You basically learning for the rest of your life is what Aries represents. The real high-level significance of it, okay? Taurus represents the family as far as the gathering of people, okay? It doesn't necessarily really represent what type of relationship. That's more so restricted for the fourth house. But the Taurus represents a group of people. It represents, right, as to where the first house represents singularity, Taurus represents a group of people, okay? It represents luxury. It represents collection of assets, okay? It represents people being assets themselves as well as inanimate objects, okay? Taurus, okay? Taurus also represents repetition to an extreme degree and fixity. What is fixity? You being fixated on something, or you wanting to do something over and over and over and over again. Most people will go ahead and say that that's restricted for Virgo or the sixth house, when not necessarily, right? And I'll explain why a few minutes. Gemini represents those group of people communicating amongst each other and sharing information and knowledge, and essentially being acquainted with one another and trusting each other, okay? Gemini also represents, because of this, it represents the media. What is the media? What is media? Media just represents information or knowledge that becomes popular because people share it back and forth, and it catches on essentially like a virus. So like you heard the term, going viral, people trying to make their videos and stuff like this go viral and things of this nature. That's Gemini, right? That's Gemini. Cancer, as well. Sorry about that, but the third house, or Gemini, right, also represents siblings. It can also represent twins. Remember, we're talking about Mercury here. Mercury can represent the twins, or physically having a twin, as well as spiritually having a twin as well, right? Mentally, spiritually, ethereally having a twin as well. So, or duality, right? The contrast between light and dark, right? The twin representing the two people, quote unquote, really one existence, but different personalities occupying one particular, right, Aries, one particular person at a time. So the fourth house represents the bottom of the chart, and the bottom of the chart represents the foundation, the family setting, right? The singularity, collection of people, siblings, and it represents the family, right? The other extensions of the family, namely the mother in specific, but it can also represent family in general. But Cancer represents specifically the mother, okay? And with Cancer, it represents, the fourth house rather, represents the bottom of the chart. And the reason for that is because Cancer represents the foundation. Cancer is represented by the physical home, apartment, house, mansion, wherever it is that you live. Cancer also rules that. Cancer also happens to rule automobiles, okay? Cancer also happens to rule heraldry. What is heraldry, right? Cancer rules heraldry along with the sixth house as well, but Cancer, or the fourth house, more really, if we're really being specific, it doesn't necessarily rule heraldry per se. It rules inheritance. It rules inheritance to come by birth, right? So it really rules birthright, okay? But I don't want to get too deep, okay? Cancer, right, is the bottom of the chart. So it also represents the things that you're learning or picking up, right? Like Aries, right? The things that you're being open-minded to at home, how it is that you are becoming, what you are learning when you're not obviously in school or in the public eye, right? The fourth house also rules private property, obviously, because your family lives in your house and your house isn't public property, right? They can't just walk through it like a sidewalk. The fifth house is ruled by Leo, and Leo obviously represents the sun as well as, oh, and Cancer rules the moon as well, right? Or the fourth house is the most comfortable house for the moon. The fifth house rules the sun, okay? It's controlled, or Leo lives there, okay? And the fifth house, right? The fifth house is controlled by Leo, not the fourth house. But the fifth house also represents the house of the father as well as the house of creativity. And when they say creativity, I mean creativity when it comes to creativity where you're creating kids, right? Physical kids, or spiritual kids, in the sense of anything that you nurture that has come out of your own passion, right? The fifth house also represents, because it's ruled by Leo, the fifth house represents the house of fame, right? That's the reason why there's a lot of Leos. A lot of people tend to know Leos, or they say that Leos get a lot of attention. It's because Leos will find themselves in their own situations, in their own lives, where they'll know a lot of people who are famous, or they'll know a lot of people just in general who aren't necessarily famous. But the one thing that a lot of those people have in commonality with each other, or in common with each other, is the fact that they will know that same specific Leo, okay? Okay, so a lot of power there, a lot of power in the fifth house. The sixth house, like I said, is ruled by Virgo, okay? And the sixth house, I was talking about how most people would think that the sixth house represents repetition, and that's to a certain extent. You have to understand that Virgo represents repetition, or it gets a bad rep for doing things over and over and over again. But that's not necessarily the case. It's really Taurus that does things over and over and over again to an extreme degree, to the point where Taurus a lot of times or the second house, Taurus a lot of the times finds themselves in damaging situations because they do something so much to the point where it becomes detrimental, as to where the sixth house is all about repetition, yes, but it's about repetition with purpose. That's part of the reason why it is that Virgo is so mutable. If there's no purpose to it, if the sixth house, or the sixth house person specifically, doesn't have a purpose to it, right? Purpose for doing what it is that it's doing, or he or she is doing. What's going to happen is that the person is going to essentially stop doing that, and they're going to move on to another cycle because of a point that they're trying to get to. So the sixth house also, like I said, gets a bad rep for being repetitive, but with purpose. The sixth house, okay, represents evolution. The sixth house represents evolution because the sixth and the seventh house are the midpoint between the other 10 or the other 5 on each side, right? These are the two houses that are in between each other, and these are the two houses that are responsible for evolution. The first to the sixth house represents individuality, okay? It represents individuality, right? First house is singularity. Second house is about your own appetites and your own desires, and what are the things that you like? What are your proclivities? The third house represents your siblings and the people whom you share conversations with, the people you socialize with on a public level. The fourth house represents the people who you socialize with on a private level. The fifth house represents, you know what I'm saying, your family members, as well as the fourth house. And then the thing is that the sixth house represents the evolution. It represents the mutability. It represents you being able to communicate with either or other people, or other people privately, other people publicly, or think for yourself, communicate with yourself internally. We call those thoughts, we call those self-dialogue, okay? The sixth house also represents work. It also represents hospitality. It also represents cleanliness, okay? This is where it is that we get the idea of OCD from, the sixth house. It's people who are neurotic. What is neurotic? Meaning nervous about being cleanly, being precautious about being overly hygienic, right? Wanting to keep their hygiene up, right? The seventh house represents the most social house. The seventh house represents Libra, right? Libra is there, right? Naturally, Libra feels comfortable in the seventh or the second house, okay? Or not, I'm gonna say comfortable in the 10th house, but it is an exaltation, right? Where you get that. But anyway, the seventh house is the most social house because, like I said before, the sixth and the seventh house deal with evolution. The evolution from the sixth house, which is ruled by Virgo, to the seventh house, which represents learning how to communicate and socialize with not just only your family members, but learning how to communicate not just with your family members and other people publicly and privately, but learning how to communicate with people in general. The relationships that are built upon the strong foundation of the first to the sixth house. The seventh house also represents the things that we put value in, okay? We put value in money. We put value in family to a certain degree. We put value in attention. We put value in trying to stunt and stuff like this, okay? So the seventh house, very important. The eighth house represents the jealousy that comes from the seventh house, okay? But the eighth house is not all about jealousy. The eighth house represents learning how to transform out of. You okay? You all right? Okay, love you. But the eighth house represents how to transform out of that modality that the seventh house can often, sometimes, I ain't gonna say often, but sometimes trap you in, right? So the eighth house, so the seventh house is about what it is that society puts value in, or what. And what do I mean when I say society? I mean, on a general sense, the agreed idea that most people should value these things to the umpteenth degree because they are the most important things, right? And what are the most important things that our society, or the popular trendy things? What are the most important things that people in general put value on? Attention, cash, who's got the most dough, you know, you know, um, who's with whom, clout, you know what I'm saying, trying to stunt on who quote unquote has power, quote unquote, even though most people don't know a single thing about power, and I could prove it. But the eighth house represents actually having the power. The eighth house represents understanding that the things that the seventh house rules or implies doesn't necessarily apply to the individual. So the eighth house represents where the individual starts to gain their power back, starts to realize that on an individual basis, the individual creates the collective that society agrees upon what is the most important thing. So the eighth house essentially is an energy, or a house in which it essentially destroys those consensualized, or those centeredized ideas of what people need to think, do, see, everything, and the eighth house is very empowering, as well as painful, and as well as overly indulgent, because the things that a lot of people may tend to find out doesn't necessarily matter as much as some people think, will often find themselves in situations where, if they don't learn how to control the rebellious nature that they've started to create for themselves, can be overly indulgent of that, right? Because they're coming out of the collective, so they could be overindulgent of that. The ninth house, right, is opposite of what? The third house, Gemini. So the ninth house represents mass production. So as to where Gemini represents media and social media and stuff like this, and right, and people just turning on to one single viral video or something that individually goes viral, or something like this, right, through social media. The ninth house represents mass production. So anything that gets mass produced is a ninth house, or has a ninth house influence, right? So anything, books, cars, anything that creates mass production, right, where it's popular but it's also mass produced, right? iPhones is a ninth house thing. Publishing rap, rap music, right, is a ninth house thing, right? And the ninth house is ruled by what? Sagittarius, right? This is the reason why the ninth house, again, also has an instance or some sort of energy of fame about them as well, because when something becomes popular, you have to create the supply and demand, right? The 10th house represents right, represents how it represents industry, it represents power, as well as the 8th house, but it represents power in differing degrees. The 8th house represents power as far as a small group of people. So it's kind of contradictory, because Aries is power in the sense of having power and not necessarily understanding what to do with it. And then the 8th, right, but the first house is also about having power as an individual, right, but also not knowing what to do with it, and well as not necessarily being selfish about it. And the 8th house represents that the 8th house represents exclusivity. The 10th house represents exclusivity too, but it represents how it is that you need a team in order to create that industry. So the 9th house is something that is mass produced, and the 10th house comes after that because it's ruled by Capricorn, and Capricorn represents the industry that you create. So those Fortune 500 companies is a Capricorn thing. The person who is at the head of the business, or the chairman, or the CEOs, specifically the chairman, is a Capricorn thing, because they are the ones they are the ones that are at the top of the food chain in their business. And remember how I said that Cancer is the bottom of the chart. Cancer represents the foundation. The 10th house, right, or the 4th house represents the foundation. The 10th house represents the top of the chart, because the top of the chart represents the zenith of your social social interactions with people, right? The zenith of it. The 11th house represents more so the 11th house is the best house in the zodiac, okay? The 11th house represents all of, I'm gonna say all, but a lot of your, at the very least, a lot of your dreams and aspirations coming into fruition and actually being self-actualized. So where the 6th house, right, wants to be self-actualized, it's working to go all the way to the 11th house, at least the 11th house, to actually become self-actualized, right? So part of the reason why it is that Virgo is the lower octave of Aquarius and Aquarius is the higher octave of Virgo. So part of the reason why. It's not the only reason why. But the 11th house, like I said, is also the best house in the chart. Okay. The 11th house also deals with groups and group activities, but it also represents individuality. Okay. It also represents individuality. It represents individuality in the sense of, from the 10th house, right, you may hire a team, industry, to delegate people to do things for you, right, in that Fortune 500 business, big business, right, that people know you for. 9th house, mass production, right, notoriety, but, or right, the 8th house, getting all this money, right. The 11th house represents you being so powerful in this industry, or so powerful in your life, you set up everything to be passive, in the sense that all this work that you would do in the 10th house you don't necessarily have to do it if you don't want to. This is why it is that they say that rich people don't work, because it's the truth. Rich people who have a business usually go ahead and hire other people to do it for them. So they essentially delegate the job. Remember, the chairman represents the head. Capricorn represents the head. But the head doesn't necessarily have to always be there, because this is why it is that they delegated everyone there for. And then the 12th house represents retirement, essentially. The 12th house represents now in the 11th house, you got your hands actually free, to where the only time you need to engage with people is to essentially make sure that everything is in tip-top shape. And now you have all this extra time on your hands. Now you can essentially live your life. The 12th house, you can live your life like this, and you only need to be seen, right, 12th house, when it's absolutely necessary. So the 12th house represents how something can pay you off for an entire lifetime, right? The 12th house is known as the invisible house, or the spirituality house. So if you I said a whole mouthful, or a lot. So if you set everything up well, from the 10th to the from the 1st to the 10th house, everything, essentially the 11th and the 12th house would be straight for you. It'll be pretty much easy. If you don't, and you're bogged down by emotionality from the 1st to the 10th house, or through the 10th house, you're going to have a lot of problems that you're going to have to fix through all of these houses, that you will essentially have to work it out. And we're all having to learn to work out the 1st to the 10th house. But you can't do that. You can't work these houses out if you're spending all this time trying to think about who's more powerful than whom, and you more preoccupied with trying to get into fights with people who you say that you love, and all these games that people does play, and who's ignoring whom, and all this other kind of craziness or whatnot. those, you got to understand, those types of people who have this kind of mentality where, you know, they're interested in trying to get clout and do all this other type of stuff, they're stuck there. They're stuck in the seventh house. They're stuck in this situation where it's like, okay, you're busy worried about all this clout and who's paying attention to you all day. But at the end of the day, is this stuff really putting you in a position where you know yourself, got a group of friends you can count on, right? You got people who can actually understand you to where y'all two can, y'all, not necessarily two, but y'all can bounce ideas off of, spin ideas off of. You have people who actually have your back that you would call your family. You've created something, you know what I mean? So yeah, man. So that was it. Comment on the video, like the video, subscribe. Peace.